Now this is a very common issue that I come up against. Phosphate tricking you. Now what can happen with an aquarium is over time the rock can become bound and literally full of phosphate, calcium diphosphate for example. Now your common test kits can only test one type of phosphate, and a lot of phosphate tests on the market are not accurate enough to actually pick up levels of phosphate enough to even be a nuisance algae. So you really want to get one of the phosphates tests that are going to test sort of 0.01. You don't want to get a one that starts at like 0.25 or something like that. You want a low level phosphate test, because if you just get a cheap phosphate test kit, it'll tell you there's no phosphate, but actually you're getting heaps of algae. And sometimes the algae is the best indicator of the phosphate, because the test kits are not a very good indicator of phosphate for several reasons. One is that the test kits available to us in the hobby only pick up one sort of calcium. I think it's, from memory, inorganic calcium. There's organic calciums, there's calcium diphosphate, there's all other different types of phosphates, all causing algae, but do not show up on your test kit. So you cannot trust your test kit to tell you what your phosphate reading is. You must trust your eyes, because if you're getting lots of algae, obviously you've got a nutrient source. Now nitrate is another nutrient source, but nitrate is a very basic nutrient. You test nitrate. If you've got an accurate nitrate test kit, it's either you got nitrate or you don't have nitrate. It's not complicated like phosphate. Phosphate will trick you. So in a situation like this, you can literally pull your hair out wondering why you keep growing algae, even though your test kit says you shouldn't be. But the reason for this is, number one, you might not be testing the phosphate that you've got. And number two is that when your rock gets so bound up with phosphate, and then slowly the phosphate will leach out into the water, and then if it's covered with a set of algae all over it, then that's going to feed all the algae. And then the algae is going to store massive amounts of phosphate. So for example, in this clutch here, removing the algae and throwing it out is a really great way of getting rid of it, because then you're literally removing the phosphate that's bound up in the algae. But if you just let that algae die, the algae actually stores way more phosphate than it'll ever use. So something like an algae filter, it only works by the algae growing, collecting all the phosphate, and you throwing the algae out. You can't leave the algae in, otherwise, as soon as the phosphate level in the water drops a little bit, the algae is going to starve. It's going to release, when it dies, it releases heaps of phosphate, which feeds all the rest of the algae. So therefore you end up in this massive spiral of headaches just through the disillusion that you've got zero phosphate. But you don't have zero phosphate. So once again, this is not uncommon. This is something that I come across. At the end of the day, if your tank looks like it's got a lot of algae, do not trust your test kit. You can send away tests to places like Triton. You should get a better understanding of different levels of phosphate from memory. But at the end of the day, if your tank looks like it's got phosphate, it's probably got phosphate. So then if you just dose it with a phosphate remover, and you just got to stay on top of it, because it's going to take months to fix. Because if you have a situation like this where there's literally algae flowing, then what you want to try to do is suck out as much of that algae as you can to remove the phosphate. You want to dose the phosphate remover, dose the phosphate remover, dose the phosphate remover, dose the phosphate remover, starting on a low dose and then slowly raising it. Don't go over what they recommend, because you also don't want to overdose it. There's disadvantages with overdosing it. If you are going to use a lanthanum-based phosphate remover, make sure you're putting in polyfilter, because you don't want to get a toxic residual. And you can use ferric iron. There's all different styles of phosphate removers. You can keep up water changes and try and use foods like Spectrum's probiotic, because the probiotic has like a anti-phosphate agent in it as well that might help a little bit. So you just need to stay the course, keep the feeding down, keep the feeding clean, keep the water changes up, keep the phosphate remover in, and do not trust your test kit. Anyway, if you have had a similar situation to this, then put a little note on the bottom of this video. The other thing too is make sure you're not overdosing nitrate removers, because that can be another source of nutrient. So if you're running any nitrate remover, make sure that that level is adjusted, especially if you have a dosing pump. So that level is adjusted according to the amount of nitrate in the water. If your nitrate goes down, your dosing must go down. And the same with the phosphate removers. If you're using liquid phosphate removers, as your algae starts to disappear, then your level must start to come down. And you must expect about a 3-week lag between any adjustments. So if you slowly raise your level, then maybe in a month you might see a slight improvement in your algae. Then if you lower your level, it might take a month before you see any difference in your algae. So phosphate remover and nitrate remover must be added cautiously, but it must be added and until you're getting the result that you actually want. Anyway, if you've got any comments or if you have any experience with any situation like this, then make sure you put a little note on the bottom of this video. But the simple solution is usually the solution. It's always something simple.